Some men built fortunes, others gathered famous names around them like jewels laid out upon velvet. Aristotle Socrates, Onassis did both. He had been born beside the Aegean, in a city of merchants and languages, and ended his life in a hospital near Paris, broken by the one loss no check could mend. He owned tankers that crossed the oceans, a yacht where statesmen and singers drank beneath warm skies, an airline that carried the name of Greece into the clouds, and a private island where the world came to stare. And yet, for all that, there had always been smoke behind him. Everyone remembered the dark glasses, the beautiful women, the president's widow, the ships, the money. Fewer remembered the boy who had watched Smyrna burn, or the father who had stood beside a hospital bed while his son lay beyond rescue. His scepter had been made not of gold, but of movement, cargo, oil, gossip, desire, and in time, even that could not be held. This is the story of a refugee who made the sea his kingdom and found, after all of it, that the sea could carry everything except grief. And grief was already waiting. January 1906. Smyrna on the Aegean coast was a city of salt air, trade, and overlapping tongues. Greeks, Turks, Armenians, merchants, clerks, sailors, teachers, families who knew how to bargain and how to survive, all moved through its streets. Into that world came Aristotle Socrates Onassis, born on the 20th of January in the Karatash suburb, into a prosperous Greek family whose comforts were real, though not yet legendary. His father, Socrates Onassis, dealt in tobacco. He was not merely a small trader scratching at the edges of commerce. He had success, standing, and ambitions of his own. The household belonged to Smyrna's Greek community, and young Aristotle grew up with the easy assumptions of a boy who believed the world had rooms prepared for him. He attended the evangelical Greek school. By 16, he had gathered languages as other boys gathered shells: Greek, Turkish, Spanish, English. Language would become one of his first forms of power. A man who could listen in many tongues could also bargain in many rooms. There was comfort in those early years. There was education. There was the smell of tobacco and the business of ships, the rhythm of a port where fortunes arrived in crates and left in ledgers. A child raised beside such things learned early that wealth was not still. It moved, it crossed water, it changed hands. He did not yet know how quickly a crown could be turned to ash. After the First World War, Smyrna passed into Greek hands, and for a brief while the future may have seemed to tilt in favor of families like the Onassises. Then the Greco-Turkish War dragged its iron weight across Asia Minor. In September 1922, Turkish forces retook Smyrna. Fire came, not as symbol, not as rumor, but as heat, smoke, panic, and human terror. Aristotle was 16. He saw the city of his birth consumed. Property vanished, security vanished. Members of his extended family were killed. The world that had formed him broke open in a matter of days. The Onassis family, once comfortable and known, became part of the great movement of Greek refugees fleeing toward Athens with what could be carried and what could be remembered. It is a terrible thing for a child to learn that houses do not protect you, that money does not necessarily stay, that names, however respected, may suddenly mean very little at a border, a dock, a burning street. In Athens, the family had survived, but survival was a narrow room. Refugees were not always welcomed tenderly. They brought grief, need, competition, and reminders of defeat. Socrates tried to rebuild the tobacco business, but the old world had not followed them across the water. Connections had been severed, property had been lost. The past, which had once seemed useful, had become a locked door. For Aristotle, the lesson cut deeply. He had been born into comfort, then stripped of it. He had seen that permanence was a bedtime story told by those who had not yet been tested. The wound did not soften him, it sharpened him. By 1923, he had made his decision. He would leave Greece. He would cross the ocean to Argentina, where Buenos Aires promised distance, noise, possibility, and anonymity. He traveled with a Nansen passport, the paper carried by stateless people, and with only a small amount of money. On the 21st of August, he arrived in Buenos Aires with $250. He was 17. He had no safety behind him. And that perhaps was his first freedom. The boy from Smyrna had nothing left to protect but himself. Buenos Aires in the 1920s was alive with appetite. It was called the Paris of South America, and in its cafes, offices, theaters, ports, and telephone exchanges, a young man could disappear or be remade. Aristotle Onassis had crossed the Atlantic without influence, but not without nerve. He took what work there was. He washed dishes, he laboured. Then he found a place at the British United River Plate Telephone Company, working nights as a switchboard operator. The pay was poor, the education was priceless. At night, while the city slept in pieces, he listened. Businessmen spoke of shipments, shortages, prices, agreements, opportunities. He learned the music of commerce from voices that did not know he was hearing them. By day, he pursued tobacco. His father and uncle were connected to a tobacco export business in Piraeus, and Aristotle began trying to create buyers in Argentina for Turkish tobacco. He was young, foreign, and easy to dismiss. Argentine cigarette manufacturers had no particular reason to welcome a teenage refugee into their offices. So he did what he would do again and again throughout his life. He made audacity serve as credentials. He watched trends. Women were smoking more publicly in the interwar years. Glamour was changing shape. Film, music, and fashion were teaching people what to desire. Onassis understood that a cigarette could be made not merely into a product, but into a signal. Elegance between two fingers, sophistication in a cloud of smoke. He created a brand aimed at women and persuaded the opera singer Claudia Muzio to be seen with it. He pursued the cigarette manufacturer Juan Gaona until the door opened, and when it did, the order was large enough to change his standing. By his mid-20s, Aristotle Onassis had made his first million. The Greek government noticed him. He helped negotiate a trade agreement with Argentina and became consul general. He also obtained Argentine citizenship. The refugee boy had walked into the world of men who signed papers, hosted dinners, shook hands, and were no longer asked too carefully where they had come from. And yet, tobacco was never going to be enough. He watched the ships. He watched who earned money when goods moved and who merely supplied the goods. During the Great Depression, when caution sat on every desk and ship prices collapsed, Onassis stepped toward the very thing others feared. Old cargo vessels could be bought cheaply. Trade was wounded, but not dead. He understood that slumps were not endings. Sometimes they were invitations. He entered shipping in the early 1930s, buying vessels at distressed prices. The details would later be dressed in the language of genius, but the heart of it was simple. He had learned to move when others froze. In 1938, he built his first tanker, the Ariston, in Gothenburg, and chartered it into the oil trade. Oil was the future's dark blood, and tankers would become its arteries. War came, and with it danger, calculation, and profit. Onassis used offshore companies and flags of convenience. He managed ships from New York. By 1945, his fleet remained modest compared with what it would become, but the pattern had been set. After the war, he bought surplus vessels, ordered new tankers, and rode the expansion of oil transport with a daring few men possessed. By the mid-1950s, his shipping empire had swollen to dozens of ships. He controlled vessels, routes, contracts, and reputations. He had taken up the scepter that the old shipping families had never meant to hand him. Still, the old wound had not closed. A man who had lost everything as a boy often spent the rest of his life acquiring proof that it could not happen again. The proof would glitter. It would also be brittle. New York, December 1946. Aristotle Onassis was 40 years old when he married Athena Livanos, known as Tina. She was 17, the daughter of Stavros Livanos, one of the great Greek shipping magnates. The marriage joined wealth to ambition, old standing to new force. For Onassis, it was more than romance. It was entry. The refugee from Smyrna, once looked upon as an outsider by the established Greek shipping circle, had married into its bloodline. Alexander was born in 1948. Christina followed in 1950. There were ceremonies, photographs, ships named and launched, children placed inside a story too large for them to understand. The family moved through New York, Europe, Greece, and the sea itself, surrounded by the signs of success. The yacht Christina, transformed from a wartime frigate into a floating palace and named for his daughter, became one of those signs. It had pleasures that sounded invented for a fable. A pool that could become a dance floor, rooms for statesmen and film stars, a stage upon the water. Onassis bought, built, charmed, and outmaneuvered. He gained influence in Monte Carlo through the company connected to the casino and resort properties. He acquired Olympic Airways and gave Greece an airline with glamour and reach. Later, he bought Skorpios, a small Ionian island, and remade it into a private retreat with beaches, harbours, trees, guest houses, and guarded privacy. If childhood had taken land from him, adulthood would purchase an island. And yet, the rooms nearest to him were already cracking. His marriage to Tina deteriorated. By the mid-1950s, they were living apart in all but public appearance. Infidelity, distance, and humiliation did their slow work. The children watched more than adults believed children watched. Alexander and Christina grew up amid privilege, but privilege is not the same as peace. We have all known something of this, fellow travelers. The polished table, the smiling photograph, the family name spoken as though it could keep out sorrow. Yet behind the door, a silence has already begun. In 1957, Onassis met Maria Callas, the great opera singer, at a party in Venice. She was Greek-American, world-famous, ferociously gifted, and already carrying the strain of a career that had demanded nearly everything from her. He was married. She was married. That, in their world, did not stop the first spark. It merely delayed the blaze. In 1959, aboard the Christina, the blaze became public. The Mediterranean lay bright around them. Distinguished guests came and went. Winston Churchill had been among those who knew the yacht's hospitality. But the story that seized attention was not political. It was the Tycoon and the soprano, both Greek in spirit, both theatrical in different ways, both famous enough to make scandal seem almost inevitable. Maria Callas left her husband. Tina divorced Onassis in 1960. What followed between Aristotle and Maria was neither calm nor easily dismissed. They loved, fought, separated, returned, and wounded one another. She wanted a permanence he would not give. He wanted devotion without surrendering control. She gave up much of her public life for a man who could not or would not become simple. The first fall did not come with ruin. It came with habit, with taking what one wanted, with confusing possession for love. And then another woman entered the room. January 1973. Athens in winter held a paler light. the sort that made concrete, tarmac, and hospital corridors seem even colder than they were. At Elinikon International Airport, Alexander Onassis arrived for what should have been a routine flight connected to Olympic Aviation, the subsidiary of his father's airline. He was 24. He had earned his pilot's license in 1967 and had accumulated many hours in the air. Flying mattered to him. It gave him a space not wholly ruled by his father's immense presence. In the cockpit, perhaps, he could be neither heir nor disappointment, neither son of Aristotle Onassis nor extension of a name. He could simply be a pilot. Father and son had not been easy with one another. Few sons of powerful men are. Alexander and Christina had been hurt by their parents' divorce. They had disliked their father's marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of President John F. Kennedy, whom Onassis had married on Skorpios in 1968. Alexander had his own love, Fiona Campbell Walter, a woman older than himself and fiercely independent. Aristotle disapproved. There had been arguments over business, over marriage, over freedom. On the 22nd of January, Alexander boarded a Piaggio amphibious aircraft with 2 other men. The plan was to practice amphibious landings between islands in the Saronic Gulf, the sort of day that should have passed into a logbook and nothing more. The plane rose. Within seconds, the right wing dropped. The aircraft crashed after a flight that lasted no more than 15 seconds. All 3 aboard were injured, but Alexander's injuries were devastating. He was taken for medical care in Athens. Aristotle was in New York when the news reached him. It was said he collapsed from the shock before forcing himself toward the airport. The next day, he arrived in Athens with Jacqueline and went directly to the hospital. Tina came from Switzerland with her new husband, Stavros Niarchos, Onassis's great rival in business and society. There are corridors in which no fortune has ever mattered. Hospital corridors are often among them. The doctors told Aristotle what fathers are not made to hear. Alexander's brain injuries were beyond hope. At 7 o'clock in the evening on the 23rd of January, 27 hours after the crash, Alexander Onassis died. And that was the moment the scepter slipped. Not in a boardroom, not in a court, not before a rival fleet. It slipped beside the body of his son. Onassis refused to accept the accident as ordinary. Alexander had been a capable pilot. The flight had lasted seconds. The other men had survived. In his grief, the explanation was too small for the pain. He suspected sabotage, murder, enemies, political forces, treachery. The inquiry found faulty controls linked to maintenance with reversed control cables. He did not rest in that answer. In December 1974, he offered $1 million for proof that his son's death had been deliberate. The money was never claimed. Alexander was buried on Skorpios. The island that had been purchased as paradise now held a grave. After that, every room Aristotle entered had an absence in it. The long fall had begun before Alexander's crash, though only afterward did everyone see it clearly. By the time Aristotle married Jacqueline Kennedy in October 1968, his life had already become a theatre where love, status, fear, and revenge played upon the same stage. The wedding took place on Skorpios in a small Greek Orthodox ceremony. To the world, it was astonishing, the Greek tycoon and the widow of the murdered American president. To him, she brought a kind of legitimacy no tanker could carry. To her, he offered security, privacy, and protection for her children after years of public grief. Maria Callas was left wounded by the marriage. Their relationship had already been tempestuous, but Jacqueline's arrival made the refusal plain. Aristotle had loved Maria, relied upon her, returned to her, and yet had chosen another woman for the place the world would see. It was said that Maria never truly disappeared from his life, even after the wedding. It was said, too, that he later understood what she had been to him. Such understandings often arrive dressed as mercy, when in truth they are only late. The marriage to Jacqueline did not bring peace. They had houses, privacy, agreements, travel, and money enough to avoid almost anything except one another. They spent increasing time apart. She preferred distance from his circle and the weight of scrutiny. He moved between business, health troubles, old attachments, and the habits of command. Christina disliked Jacqueline. Alexander had been openly skeptical. The household became a place where courtesy could not quite hide resentment. There were business shadows as well. Onassis had never been a gentle merchant. He had used flags of convenience, offshore companies, holding structures, and loopholes that helped reshape modern shipping. He had angered American and British interests with a Saudi oil transport agreement in the 1950s. He had faced controversy over whaling off South America. He had fought Prince Rainier in Monaco for influence over the principality's commercial future and eventually lost that struggle. These were not small matters, but he had met them, as he met most things, with appetite, timing, and the conviction that rules were obstacles best negotiated around. After Alexander died, that old force weakened. The man who had once seemed to live by sheer voltage began to dim. Friends saw him age quickly. Suspicion grew around him. He had always been superstitious, and now superstition had fertile soil. Some in his circle believed Jacqueline had brought misfortune into the family. John Kennedy had been assassinated, Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, and now Alexander was dead. Grief, when it cannot find meaning, often chooses a pattern. We watch these lives, and something stirs in us. Pity, perhaps, or unease, or the quiet knowledge that even at the top, with guards and doctors and pilots and private islands, the blow still found its way through. Tina Livanos, his first wife and the mother of his children, died in 1974. Another old door closed. Aristotle's health, already fragile, worsened. He suffered from myasthenia gravis, and breathing became part of the struggle. His business affairs remained large, but size no longer consoled him. Ships still moved, oil still moved, money still moved. The machinery he had built continued to turn with a kind of insult. He had wanted Alexander to inherit not only the fortune, but the proof of his life. Without his son, the grand design seemed to lose its center. Christina remained, loyal and wounded in her own way, but the father's dream had been shaped around the son. Greek families know the danger of such dreams. So do kings. So do ordinary fathers who never speak of it. Maria Callas became a presence again in his final years, a comfort from the life he had not chosen cleanly. They spent time together in Paris. It was said he kept near him a red cashmere Hermes blanket she had given him. Whether the object mattered for warmth or memory hardly matters now. Men like Onassis rarely admitted need. In the end, the smallest tendernesses sometimes outlast the most public vows. By 1975, the rooms had narrowed. The yacht, the island, the airline, the tankers all remained part of the legend. But the man had begun to retreat from his own legend. The sea was still full of his ships. The house was not full of his son. Early 1975. Paris was grey, and Aristotle Onassis was very ill. He entered the American hospital in Paris, far from Smyrna, far from Buenos Aires, far from the first offices and ports where he had taught himself how men made money. The illness that had been stalking him had grown stronger. Myasthenia gravis weakened the body's command of itself. Respiratory trouble followed. Breath, the simplest thing, became labor. There is a particular indignity in the decline of powerful men. They have spent their lives issuing instructions, summoning cars, telephones, captains, lawyers, doctors, lovers, assistants. Then, one day, the body refuses to obey. No secretary can arrange a reprieve. No captain can change the weather inside the lungs. His marriage to Jacqueline remained, but it no longer had the shape of companionship. She was off and away. The contract endured more clearly than the tenderness. Christina stood nearer to him in loyalty, though she too had been damaged by the family's storms. Maria Callas, the woman he had not married, hovered in the final story like music heard through a wall. He had been for decades a man of movement. Buenos Aires, New York, Monte Carlo, Athens, Paris, London, Skorpios. Harbours, boardrooms, decks, bedrooms, salons. His life had been a map drawn by appetite. Now it had contracted to a hospital room. On the 15th of March 1975, Aristotle Socrates Onassis died near Paris. He was 69 years old. His death was tied to respiratory failure and illness after months of decline. It was plain. It was physical. It was not softened by the size of the estate. After all the crossings, he was carried back to Skorpios and buried beside Alexander. That was the final geography of his life, the island he had bought as a private paradise, the grave of the son who had died too young, and the father placed near him at last. There was still the matter of money, because money is always left behind to trouble the living. Christina inherited a major part of the fortune. A large share went to the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, created in memory of the son whose death had broken him. Jacqueline later received a substantial settlement and stepped away from the estate's battles. The figures were large. The inventories were impressive. Ships, holdings, property, cash, securities, interests in buildings, an island, a name. And yet the stillness on Skorpios was not altered by arithmetic. The broken scepter lay where no banker could reach it. After Aristotle Onassis died, the world kept the easier images, the dark glasses, the thick silver hair, the yacht Christina, Maria Callas, radiant and wounded, Jacqueline Kennedy, veiled by history before she ever reached him, Skorpios guarded and sunlit, the tankers moving like black-backed animals across the water. Christina inherited wealth, but not ease. Her own life would be troubled by marriages, illness and sorrow, and she died young in 1988. Maria Callas died in Paris in 1977. Olympic Airways changed hands. The yacht was sold and transformed. Skorpios remained with the family for decades before passing beyond them. The things that had looked permanent became, as things do, arrangements. The foundation bearing Alexander's name endured, supporting culture, education, health, and Greek heritage. That is one kind of afterlife, and not a small one. A father's grief became an institution. A dead son's name was placed over doors where others might be helped. There is tenderness in that, though not consolation. We stand, fellow travellers, at a distance from such lives and see their outline more clearly than those who lived inside them. A boy lost a city. A young man crossed the ocean. A businessman mastered timing, risk, and desire. A father lost his son. The sea carried his fortune and then carried him home. There was no neat punishment in it, no tidy lesson tied with black ribbon. Only a man who built what he could because he had once watched everything burn, and who learned late and terribly that not all losses can be answered by building more. In the end, the palace was quiet, the throne empty, and the fallen scepter rested beside the shore. If you found yourself in this story even for a moment, you may find yourself in the next one too. Subscribe to The Fallen Scepter and stay with us, there are many more lives to remember.